Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. You can also engage with us through Twitter and Facebook. We would love to hear from you. And now, here's your host, Rob Macwood, better known to his friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this first episode of Season 3. We are looking forward to bringing you some compelling conversations that will help you be more effective in engaging in the Great Commission. As we get started today, let me quickly bring to your attention just one of the improvements to the Global Missions Podcast website. We've worked to improve the search function on the homepage to help you find episodes about a particular theme that you might be interested in. Maybe you're looking for all the episodes about short-term missions or tent making, for example. The new filter will be helpful in quickly locating episodes about a particular topic. We hope that'll be of good use to you. Now, for our episode today, the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada recently conducted a very significant research project with a big, long title, the Canadian Evangelical Missions Engagement Study Series. Now, we don't want all of our friends who are outside of Canada in the United States or around the world to turn off this episode. We know that the trends will be helpful and of interest to you. We decided not to put this big, long thing in a title. We've simply called it Evangelicals and Missions, Trends to Consider. Our guest for today's conversation is Rick Hiemstra, who together with his wife, Beth, and their 4 kids currently lives in our nation's capital, Ottawa, Ontario. Rick serves now as the Director of Research and Media Relations at the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. Sometimes we call it the EFC. And he has also served as a pastor and a high school teacher in the past. He regularly speaks on church and cultural trends, so we are really glad to engage with him today. Rick, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Glad to be on the show.
If you would begin, please, just by telling us a little bit about your current role at the EFC.
My principal role at EFC is to study the church in Canada. So we look at things like Bible engagement, to study missions engagement. I'm currently working on a study looking at how do we help young adults stay connected to the church. And then I speak with pastors and church leaders across the country about what I find out.
Well, today's our opportunity to unpack some of the learning from this national survey, which was exploring how evangelicals, and in particular Canadian evangelicals, engage with mission or missions. So, Rick, please tell us just a little bit, why was this study undertaken and how did you go about it?
Well, we started the study when some people from a group called the Canadian Missions Research Forum, which is a group of executives from about 15 mission agencies, and there's a few denominations that are part of the group. They came and they said, we're sort of noticing a decrease in the number of people sensing a call to long-term career missions, and we want to find out why. But we want to learn about what is happening in the local churches. How are local churches thinking about missions?
And when you began to do the research in earnest, what was your model? How did you go about it?
Well, we did it in a couple of stages. When we looked in the literature to see what other people had done, and there actually wasn't a lot of research that had studied what local churches did with respect to missions. Then we decided that we would talk to ministry experts. So we talked to denominational leaders, mission agency leaders, people who teach intercultural studies and global missions in Bible colleges and seminaries. Mm-hmm. And out of that, then developed a set of questions, and we went and talked to more people. We talked to pastors and we talked to lay people. And we broke those pastors out as a group because we found that pastors are just so important in terms of what happens with missions engagement in local congregations. And out of that, we then developed 2 national surveys. We did one with lay people, and we did that on Angus Reid Forum, which is a large national pollster here in Canada. And we did another with pastors that we recruited through our affiliate networks and our different networks with the Canadian Missions Research Forum. We tried to make it as representative as possible, and these were large surveys. We had over 2,000 in the lay survey responded, and about 1,400 pastors.
One of the conclusions from the survey that caught my attention as we dive in there, Rick, is that the attention of our church, of the church, has gradually changed. What do you mean by our attention has changed, and what's going on there?
Well, we only have a certain capacity to pay attention to things, and we only have so much time. And over the last number of decades, with the sort of the rise of the internet, and then on top of that, cell phones, and then on top of that, smartphones, we have more and more devices in ways where our attention can be sort of fragmented and gobbled up in little pieces, so that you can we have people spending all kinds of time now on social media that they never used to spend on social media, for instance. We have all kinds of opportunity to spend time on texting. And what happens as you take this time is that the time that was left for other things, more concentrated things, is gone. And it's not just that we're losing an aggregate amount of time, it's that we don't have the time for sustained attention on the things that we used to. Giving sustained attention to something like work on a missions committee or sustained attention in a church at a missions fair, it's harder and harder to find this big block of time where you can bring people in and educate them about missions, introduce them to a missionary or a missions work. And that is what is changing in the culture.
Well, we think about social media and some of the even popular ones, Facebook, of course, and Instagram and Pinterest and Twitter and so forth. Those things, even a decade ago, wouldn't have been nearly as predominant as they are now. And you're ubiquitous now, everywhere, all the time.
Yeah, it's sometimes hard for us to believe, but most of these technologies have only been around for about 10 or 15 years. Facebook is about 15 years old. The iPhone is about 10 years old. So we've gone from sort of nothing to something that dominates up to, a whole work week of people's lives. That's how some studies say that's how much time we spend on our phones now, where we unlock our phones about 80 times a day to check them. A decade ago, we weren't doing that. And even the act of doing that changes your habits. It changes the way you think. Psychologists say that once your attention is taken off a task, it actually takes you about 20 minutes to completely focus on that task again. And if you're being called away from it 80 times a day, it's very hard to get that central focus.
Yeah, wow. Now, did you find that there were some ways that this relates particularly to the discussion about missions?
I think that people's ability to give sustained attention to something that is far away has changed. In the interviews, it came out, there's an irony that because we think that we can reach out and connect with a missionary at any time through social media, we actually do it less. And we do it in a less intentional way than we might have when we were writing a letter, say, and it would take months. So we would sit down and we'd put a lot of thought and careful planning into that letter. Now we can connect, but the irony is that, or the paradox is that we don't connect as much.
Amazing. We have the opportunity to be more connected, but we're not really more connected.
Because we feel that they're closer. And so therefore, we don't have to make the effort to go out of the way because we think we could get them whenever we need them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, move on to a next question then. Another change that we have seen inside of our churches in many cases is the dynamic of evening services. Historically, many churches have held services of some sort, either on a Sunday evening or perhaps a weekday evening. And in recent years, many have discontinued those evening services. How has this change impacted missions?
In the qualitative interviews that we did, lots of people told us that the Sunday evening service or the midweek service was the opportunity that missionaries typically had to get in front of a congregation. And often they would be given the whole service and they would have 40 minutes, an hour to tell people about the mission, give them the kind of information that would help people to deeply engage with the mission, and very importantly, allow the missionary to form a relationship with the congregation and individuals in the congregation. Mm-hmm. About the mid-90s, you started to see churches, and I think this is a result of the fragmentation of attention. People just didn't have that time anymore to give to evening services. Churches started dropping those evening services. What this meant is that the only time churches had to connect with all of their people became that Sunday morning service. It's a little bit like real estate, right? You have worship time. Real estate here was now more valuable, and pastors simply weren't as willing to give up big blocks of time for missions presentations. And so we had a lot of people tell us in the interviews that now you're lucky to get 5 minutes, or if you go into a worship service, a pastor will want to rather interview a missionary so that they can kind of control and manage that time block, so that maybe they do a 10-minute interview instead of giving you a 40-minute sermon. And this is because pastors get this enormous amount of pressure from their boards to use that time for the purposes of the local congregation and their ministry.
Is there something that you would recommend to churches or to missions committees to try and adjust here? Is there some response you might propose?
Well, I think that we need to find new ways to connect with people about missions. But here's the thing that I've realized about the ways of connecting. We have lots of ways to connect. We can connect through podcasts. We can connect through social media. We can connect through the phone, texting. But the connections that work have a relational, emotional component to them. And so you have to find a way to connect where a relationship goes along with the communication. This is why we found when people were forming relationships with missionaries, and we asked about that, almost always there was a recommendation from somebody they trusted or some sort of relational connection that preceded the ability to form a relationship with the missionary. And this is what's missing in sort of bare communications. And this is why when you send out these letters, people will read it if they already have a relational connection with you. So we have to find ways to piggyback on relationships that already exist.
Very good. Well, moving to another theme, and I've just add toward the end of this interview, we will provide links to the whole survey so that if you'd like to read more deeply on these things, you'll have that opportunity. I'm just asking Rick to comment quickly on some of the macro trends that he has identified in the research. So, Rick, turning to the church's engagement of unreached people groups, sometimes we call them UPGs. I read in the survey, in the summary, that according to pastors, the church's top 3 priorities for missions include ministry to the unreached, poverty relief, and working with national churches. So it seems that mission effort to unreached peoples is a high priority. However, the survey also indicated that evangelism among Muslim, Hindu, and Buddhist people groups was a low priority. So there seems to be a contradiction or a tension here, and I wonder what you make of this contradiction.
When we're doing the research and I was doing some of the background literature reading, the idea of unreached people groups was originally introduced at Lausanne in 1974. There was a paper that was there, and part of why Lausanne was called is that colonies were closing, and there was a sense that if the colonial powers went home, that the missionaries that sort of came in with the colonial powers should go home as well. And Lausanne was an attempt to say, no, missions is still a calling of the church. This is still something that we should be doing. Interestingly, in the Muslim, Hindu, and Buddhist world, you had colonial powers in a lot of the areas where these were. And I think that out of Lausanne, we came away with the sense that there was some sort of cultural shame sort of attached to colonial missions. But of course, the unreached people groups are places where missionaries had never named the name of Christ. And so that it was okay to go and preach the name of Christ there. And so in our thinking, there is a difference in how we're thinking about unreached people groups and the Muslim, Buddhist, and Hindu world, even though most of those people in the world there would never have heard of Christ or heard the gospel preached in its fullness.
In one of our episodes last season, we heard on the Joshua Project interview that 86% of Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists have never personally met a Christ follower. And so somehow want to continue to highlight that important need around the world. Interesting that it seems to be a priority, but maybe we're not getting wheels on our intentions here.
I think that there is a sense that the unreached people groups, when people think of it, I think generally it's thought of these are animists. I think because we have daily contact in North America with Hindus, Muslims, and Buddhists, we think of them as already having a religion and we know them, but we don't meet with many animists. And I think that we have to return to the sort of the roots of our missions theology, if you will, and sort of rediscover the calling that Christ made to go to every tongue, tribe, and nation.
Well, here I'll mention for our listeners, if you'd like to look back through the library of previous episodes, there were 2 last year, episodes 52 and 53, focused on unreached people groups. One was with Dwayne from the Joshua Project, and the other with David Johannes, who's a mission worker in Asia, trying to help describe who are these unreached peoples and where are they located. You can find those in last year's episodes. We're going to take a quick break now and highlight a missions resource that we hope will be helpful for you and your church.
SIM Canada is convinced that no one should live and die without hearing God's good news. We believe that He has called us to make disciples in communities where He is least known. Use your skills, share the gospel, and make disciples. Check out www.sim.ca to learn more. And now, back to today's conversation.
We're back with Rick Hiemstra, the Director of Research and Media Relations for the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada. And Rick is helping us unpack some of what's been learned from a recent survey about how evangelicals participate in missions. Rick, I'd like to talk a bit about the promotion of or the advocacy for missions in a local church. According to the survey results, both pastors and lay people said it's usually a pastor who is the most prominent missions advocate or mobilizer. What can we learn from this?
Well, I think that there is just a really practical administrative reality to church life, that the pastor is the one that is usually in the church, receiving the communications, the person that they send emails to, support letters, that answers the phone or gets phone calls put through to them. And a lay person, generally in our culture, just doesn't have the time for that. So pastor's time is fragmented. I think one of the things that we need to realize is that pastors are asked to do far more than they used to do. And there's a wide range of activities that they're asked to do. So if pastors, again, they are able to promote missions because people trust them. There is a filtering that goes on in people's lives. Their attention is fragmented and they aren't able to process all the information that comes. And so what we do is we use shortcuts. And the shortcut that most of us use is we learn what is important in missions because we look at somebody that we trust. And if they say we should pay attention to this, that is the processing that happens. So if missions committees want the pastor to be in a better place to be able to promote missions, they have to essentially help him or her. So what they need to do is digest the information and create the space, make it easy for the pastor to promote missions, recognizing that the relationship that most people have in the congregation is with the pastor in terms of who do they trust, and that relationship will be the gateway for most people. Then if the pastor makes a recommendation for a mission or a missionary, that's the gateway through which those relationships will be established.
And we want to esteem those who are serving in pastoral roles and provide good tools for them. Just to interact with that idea a little further of how important the pastor is, there are implications for agencies as far as the strategic nature of those relationships with pastors. If one hopes to lift the advocacy for global missions, it seems that the pastor is going to be a key relationship.
Absolutely. And in our qualitative interviews, when we talked with some pastors, there were a few interesting interviews where pastors would talk about how much they just appreciated agency reps coming and sitting down for them and having coffee with them and talking about the work of the mission agency. And it wasn't that they were learning anything new. It was the relational element of having somebody from the agency sitting down and talking to them. And I think in one case in particular, these pastors from a reasonably large church, I think it was a church of about 400, they just invited the rep from the mission agency into their church on a regular basis to talk about the missions and promote mission and promote the work. But what was really clear here is that the relationship was important. We asked lots of questions about the kinds of communications people are looking for. And nobody said, stop sending me your prayer letters or stop sending me your update letters. But you need a relationship behind the communication, or people simply will not prioritize it and read it and digest it and pray about it.
Well, just another angle on this, I wonder, in the role of seminaries or perhaps Bible schools, those who are training pastors, there are going to be implications here as well, that to include, hopefully, global mission awareness in a program, although it might not be a focus, a bachelor's or a master's degree in intercultural studies, still to have elements of global missions so that the pastor has some heart for that?
Yeah, we found that there was a real difference in the missions engagement of pastors who had taken a few missions or intercultural courses and those that hadn't. And it seems that having that awareness, having that maybe a personal experience that followed up on that, where the learning in class was cemented in a missions experience, that changes pastors and how they understand the mission of the church. And, whether the mission of the church is primarily a mission about their local congregation, or whether there is always an element of going across borders, going outside of your neighborhood and serving the church.
If we can encourage those who are studying and preparing to serve in pastoral roles to have that awareness, it seems more likely, naturally, that they'll engage with their local congregation. Rick, let's talk finally about how God calls people into missions. According to the survey, respondents usually indicated that they would be reluctant to encourage their children or grandchildren to consider long-term career missions. To which I said, wow, where do you think that's coming from?
Well, I'm doing some other youth research right now, and there is a real sense that the choices that young adults make must be completely autonomous in order to be authentic. And that's where this reluctance, I think, is coming to encourage young adults to consider long-term career missions. There's also fears about the dangers of the mission field. There's concern about how financially lucrative missions might be as a career. But overall, there is a reticence because I think we as a church have bought into this quite a bit, that it should be completely autonomous. And if the decision of a young adult isn't unique and autonomous, that it is not authentic. And I think we need to challenge that, because God does come and call individuals, but he also uses his church to do some of that calling. The Holy Spirit works through individuals, works through Scripture, and we have to help young adults to see that as authentic ways to hear from God as they discern.
Well, I was glad to hear that if people do decide to go into missions, that often their families will be supportive then. That was another side of the research as well. Rick, I wonder, in all this research that you have done, was there anything that just surprised you? You thought, wow, I did not expect that.
I suppose I was surprised the extent to which people looked at short-term missions trips as a way to disciple, as first and foremost a way to disciple the people in their congregation, especially young adults. And this went even further. There was a substantial minority of people that thought that we should be having non-Christians on our short-term missions teams. And they saw that as a form of evangelism, outreach to the people on the team. Mm-hmm. And it sort of made me stop and think, what are our real goals when we do our short-term missions trips? I was very surprised that very seldom did people actually talk about the work that they were going to do on the mission field or the people that they were meeting on the mission field. And I think, discipleship is a great thing for us to be doing with our congregations. But I think that we need to build some clarity into what we're doing and why we're doing it. And I think that we will do both our discipleship better and we will do our short-term missions trips better.
Mm-hmm. Well, one last question here, Rick, about the research, and that is, if you had the opportunity to stand before a group of pastors and perhaps lay people too, but especially the influencers of missions, global missions, having done this research, what would you want to say to them? What advice do you have for them?
My advice would be that if you want to promote missions within your congregation, you have to practically map out the relationships in your congregation. As I've been saying, people's attention is fragmented, and they will only pay attention to things if there is a relationship that they trust that makes a recommendation for them. So if we're going to be wise about what goes on, recognizing that people can't process everything for themselves, we have to understand who are the people that people in our church look up to, and we need to enlist them as allies in promoting missions. And if we've got a pastor who's busy, we have to go to the pastor and say, missions is a priority. How can we help you promote missions? What is keeping you from giving this the kind of attention that we believe biblically it deserves?
Well, it's good advice from Rick Hiemstra. Rick, just appreciate so much the time you've spent with us to take the tops of some of the high mountains here in the research. If our listeners would like to learn more about the EFC survey or to contact you, how can they do that?
You can get downloads, free PDF downloads of the survey documents at theefc.ca/CMRF. That's Canadian Missions Research Forum. Or you can email me, and I believe that will be in the podcast notes.
We will make sure that that information is in as links in the show notes if you'd like to follow up. Rick, thanks again for spending this time with us, and thank you for the effort that you have invested on behalf of our community to help us understand better the realities that we're facing. Glad to have you in this environment and pray that the Lord will bless you as you continue your ministry.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Well, that's it for today. We hope that you found this interview together with Rick to be engaging and insightful, considering some of the important trends before us. If you did enjoy the episode, we'd sure appreciate a review on iTunes. This helps potential listeners decide if they'll give this podcast a try. And as our regular listeners already know, we're always glad to hear from you with suggested topics for interviews in the future. The Global Missions Podcast is produced by the Jaffrey Centre for Global Initiatives and Send International of Canada in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of our team, thanks for listening today. We invite you to join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.